slides? Okay.
Yeah, just say next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
Or make a funny noise or something like that.
Welcome, everyone. You are with us with the Broadband in the Capital Region webinar and presentation. We'll start in just a couple minutes.
This is where I can get up and do my tap dance. Keep everybody entertained while we wait.
You're muted, Kate.
Right.
We need like a countdown clock.
Thanks for joining, folks. We're just going to give it another couple minutes for folks to log in.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I see it's about 10:03, at least according to my clock. So we want to keep everything on topic or on target in terms of time. So we're going to go ahead and get going. Thank you for joining us today. My name, for those who don't know me, is Kate Maynard. I'm the Planning and Economic Development Director with the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. For those who aren't aware, we are an organization focused on regional initiatives and programs focused on the capital region. So Albany, Rensselaer, Saratoga, and Schenectady counties, typically. We're here today to discuss broadband in the capital region, specifically the broadband assessment that's currently underway for New York State, and also discuss important next steps and potential for our region. As many on this call are aware, broadband was already emerging as a necessary infrastructure in years past. COVID put a giant spotlight on how critical it was as people pivoted online for work, school, medical appointments. Many of us have stories. Also, it highlighted the deep digital divide that separates those that have service to those that do not. As we continue to emerge from the pandemic, we know that this accessibility to broadband service will only continue to grow, and there's a great need to provide connection to unserved areas, improve service, and eliminate barriers such as affordability to the service. In the capital region, we have discussed the issue with other stakeholders at the state, federal, and local level, and we continue to work to focus on sharing activities that are being done currently and connecting local, regional, state, and federal activities and an awareness of current and future funding opportunities. So exactly along those lines, we are very happy to welcome ECC Technologies to speak with us today on this topic. A couple housekeeping notes. We will have you please enter any questions that you have in the Q&A. Also, you can use chat throughout in terms of anything that comes up. We will try to respond to those as the presentation continues on. Also, at the end, we will have time for questions specifically and discussion. And from speaking with many of you, I would be very surprised if you don't have further things to ask about or further points in terms of how we leverage this particular opportunity and what's coming down the pipe for the Capital Region. So without further ado, with that said, I now want to introduce Joe Starks, Jeff Brooks, Corey Brown, and Justin Zagowski. I hope I pronounced that right, Justin. From ECC Technologies. ECC Technologies is the firm currently completing the New York State Broadband Assessment on behalf of New York State DPS. For more than 20 years, they have worked with a focus on community and regional access to broadband for residents and businesses. So I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, if you want to share your screen and start the presentation.
Great, I can do that. So I cannot start screen share. Now I can. Okay, sorry.
I stopped.
Click that button, and we'll click that button. And ideally, everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, good deal. So I'll say good morning to everybody. My name is Jeff Brooks. As Kate said, I'm with ECC Technologies. Thank you very much for joining us. I had the opportunity to see some of the attendees on the list. So good morning to a number of you who we've already met in person, or at least via the magic of some of these video calls. And what Joe, Corey, and myself will try and lay out for you today is the work that we're doing for the state of New York for this broadband assessment across all counties in the state. And Joe in particular, and Corey as well, will bring their particular expertise to bear in talking about some of the issues that are facing counties today that especially impact the capital region. And certainly we welcome discussion on both the program and the discussion of other topics related to broadband. So one of the things that we tried to do when we put this together is to make sure we had, especially with it getting a little cooler in New York, is ideally many of these slides will share with you what springtime, summer, and fall are like in the Empire State. So hopefully you may recognize some scenery as the slides flash by. Wanted to provide this summary. I'll kick it off. Joe Starks, who is our founder and president, will follow me, and then Corey Brown, our chief technology officer, will discuss some of the more detailed components relative to the collection of inventory and infrastructure data across the state. I'll talk about some of the programs in place to support gathering information from that most important part of this to me, and that is the resident of each county. We call it voice of the customer, voice of the citizen. And then Joe will wrap it up with a summary of what we have learned in working with counties, not only through most of New York, but also up and down the East Coast of the United States, share his thoughts on potential next steps. And then, of course, we're happy to take questions. Also on this slide, and I believe Kate indicated that it would be distributed, is our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us. We certainly welcome any questions or inquiries you may have. If you have a question during this presentation, if we know the answer, we'll tell you. If we don't know it, we'll tell you that too, but we'll find it. We can get that information back to you. So the key thing to me is we have always believed as a company, and this goes back to what Kate alluded to earlier, that across our 25-year history, everything related to broadband is local. It's great that issues are recognized at the state level. I believe it's a very strong component of advanced progress where federal lawmakers are funding broadband programs. But at the end of the day, it's whenever you sit down in Greene County or Onondaga County or Wyoming County or Dutchess County, and you have conversations with the mayor of a township or a village supervisor, or you talk to a small business owner or a teacher, you really understand that the issues are at that very local level. They're not solved in Albany. They're not solved in Washington, D.C. And this is what we always like to lead with when we have discussions with our clients. You can see here that we're trying to emphasize that local is important by simply placing maps of counties. Think in terms of the progress that each of your counties have made over the past 125 years. We're still making this progress today as we push forward for universal broadband availability across the region. So what I'd like to do is to hand this off to Joe and let him begin to discuss the project and the value of the project to the counties in the region.
Thanks, Jeff. I think what I'd like to say, I'd like to hit on a point, Jeff, that you brought up, and that is that, for over 20 years, we've been dealing with broadband, primarily in rural areas. The haves and the have-nots is the way it started, and it's just kind of progressed from there. And haves and have-nots is a big issue, but also adoption is a big issue as well. So when we think about broadband, it's not only do I have it or don't I have it, but if I have it and I don't use it, why? The one thing that we have learned is that 2020 has changed everything in terms of communications with folks, with residents, with your medical folks, with your government. And it's become a top priority, and you're absolutely correct. It is not necessarily something that's going to be solved by the federal government or state government, but it's solved at local levels. And we have been doing this for 20 years, and you have to ask yourself, why hasn't this been solved? Well, for 20 years, everybody's taken a different approach to how they want to solve the broadband issues. But until now, nobody's really documented, like the state of New York is with this project. They haven't documented the physical level of broadband to just try to get that out of the way, if you will, and put some meaningful solutions in place. So we're excited about this project because we believe that it will solve the broadband availability issues once and for all. And for 20 years, we've been doing these studies, and some of the regions that we've done studies in, we're doing them again. So be sure history does repeat itself. And communities now, they really have to pay attention, because if we don't, then we're going to be left behind. So we have a unique opportunity here to take care of this and solve these issues. And that's what we hope is going to come out of this New York State project. Next slide, Jeff. Let's talk for a moment about what communities are doing. And this is not only a local, this is national. And quite frankly, it's going on around the world right now. But without the communities, the local communities taking a leadership role on this, I think we've seen that this problem is not going to get solved. So the local communities, they have to play a leadership role. They have to bring the partners together, and they have to make sure that they're getting what they need out of these projects, and not just the providers who are real happy, quite honestly, not to build out to rural areas if they don't have to. So with the community taking a leadership role, we can ensure that most of that work is going to get done. You've got to develop meaningful programs. Having, just saying, I want broadband on this street, that's not going to solve the problem. You've got to have a program in place. And there's a reason why a lot of these folks don't have broadband, and that's because it's not affordable. It's just not to the point where the return on investment by a for-profit company is reasonable for them. So the communities have to step up to the plate, and they have to sometimes provide funding, sometimes provide grant access, but you need to take the leadership role, and you need to create those partnerships with the providers to make this happen. Some communities choose to build their own broadband networks, and I think we'll see over time how that's going to play out. But at a very minimum, you need to create these partnerships to solve these issues. And that's what's going on across the country today. Next slide, please. Let's talk for a moment about the New York State Broadband Project. First of all, it's the only one that we're aware of in the United States that's underway. And we are doing an inventory of broadband throughout the entire state. We're roughly 50% done with that today. And essentially what does that mean is that means that we've got outside plant designers and engineers driving 1.5 million+ miles of roads in New York State, predominantly rural areas. We're not inventorying New York City, for example. We're not inventorying Syracuse or Albany or Binghamton or any of those cities because we already know the infrastructure is in place there, right? Their issues are more related to adoption than they are about is the infrastructure in place or not. So we're not inventorying the cities, but we are doing the rural areas. We're documenting where the broadband infrastructure is, and that's fiber optics and coax. That information is going to be put into a GIS database, and Corey will get into that more in a few minutes. And it's going to be used for modeling. So essentially, what does that mean is we're going to know exactly where the infrastructure is and where it isn't to an address level. Secondarily to this, and equally as important to help solve the adoption issues, is we want to capture the user side of broadband. We want to understand what broadband issues do you have? Do your students have a problem working from home because of broadband? If you have access to broadband and you don't have it, why? Is it an issue if you can't afford it? You don't want it. You use your cell phone. There's a lot of reasons why folks won't use broadband even though they have access to it. So we want to document that to the extent possible. And then there's the creation of interactive tools that are going to come out of this. And the interactive tools will be such that we can take a look at a particular street or a particular road, and we can tell where the broadband infrastructure stops, and then what's going to be required to continue that infrastructure. That's very important today because, as I mentioned earlier, it's not affordable to build infrastructure in some of these places, 2 or 3 or 4 homes per mile. The numbers just don't work. So how do we fix that? How do we get the money focused on that and make sure that those things get taken care of? Because we do want everybody to have access to broadband. And that interactive website will help us with that interactive GIS site. The website also, that's going to explore broadband options. And I believe Corey's going to get into that a little bit more in detail. But that's going to essentially give address level information to the public, not necessarily infrastructure information, but service related information, such as, who provides broadband and is there competitive access to services at a given address. So all of this information is being gathered today. As I said, we're roughly 50% done with the inventory side of it. And we're really starting to ramp up on the personal side of broadband, capturing user information. And we are right now targeted to complete this in the May timeframe of 2022. Next slide, Jeff. I think, Corey, I turn this over to you. Is that correct?
Yep. So, thanks, Joe. So obviously, we've got a couple of portions of how to kind of create and assemble a master GIS database out there. So we've got kind of a 2-phase approach that we're going to be using here. So obviously, Joe had mentioned that our OSP crews are out crisscrossing the state as we speak right now, collecting all of the information that they can get on a visual inspection of all those roads. Again, in kind of the rural and underserved areas out there. The second piece of that is going to be with the legislation that was passed. DPS has issued basically notifications to all of the providers within New York State to basically be able to provide that information to us so we can, again, kind of assemble and put together between what we're doing on the physical inventory side with what we're getting from the providers and marrying those 2 data sets up. So what was going to happen on that is we're most likely going to have some potential discrepancies between what we get from the providers and what we've actually seen out in the field. That'll give us the time frame so we can go back, and then if we need to do perhaps another visual inspection of any particular areas that providers are issuing that they do have service on there, we'll be able to, again, kind of do that visual confirmation of how that service or telecom infrastructure is actually deployed in that particular service area. So once we kind of get that information put together, we'll do some QCing work on the GIS database, and again, kind of assemble a master plan that's going to be able to allow us to run basically calculations from that infrastructure And to New York State's point is that they really want to get down to the address level detail of how providers are serving their communities out there. So as you can see, we basically are going to generate some mapping information on the back end side that'll indicate, where the telecommunications infrastructure is and is not. And then based on the provider data we get and the technology they're using, we're going to basically be building buffers off of that particular line work to be able to use for GIS in those calculations. So as we kind of get into the website for the public, where we can have residents perform actual queries on an address or a particular location, there's going to be kind of a couple of options on there where you can basically punch in an address on a website, or you can go into an interactive mode on the map and kind of zoom around the state to get that visual kind of look and feel for how the state's actually covered for broadband services. So if the resident goes in there and then punches in their address, they're going to give basically a little push pin option out there that'll give a little zoomed in map of where we believe they're asking about for the service. They'll have the ability to kind of fine tune that to make sure that, if the push pin doesn't land exactly on the rooftop structure of what they're looking to do that query on, they can move that around. And then when they're all set with that option on there, they can basically hit the go button. And what that's going to do is on the public side of the map is display a chart of providers, their service capabilities for that area, as well as a link to the respective carrier or provider's website to get in more information if they want to get into pricing or any of the other scenarios like that as far as that service goes for that particular location. So what there will be on there as we're building these buffers based on the line work that you see here on the map, there's more than likely going to be maybe a couple of different zones. Typically, a provider is going to have like their standard installation service area that might be, say 250 feet off of their infrastructure. So that would be the first buffer. But we know that, say, a fiber drop cable for somebody providing fiber to the home services could actually potentially run that out to 1,000 feet. So what we're asking the providers to give us is the distances or footages that what we call their standard installation or maybe a service capable area with some caveats or maybe an asterisk down there that, hey, we can probably do this, but it may require a site visit or it may require an additional service charge, but something denoting that whoever's making that query, they'd be able to tell that, service is most likely possible, but there'll be like an asterisk down there to kind of indicate how that's going to play through in order to deliver that internet service to their home or to the structure that they're making the query on. So not only does this map serve the residents out there, but it also has a commercial option there as well. So you will have the option to basically toggle whether you're doing an inquiry for residential services or commercial services, because there will be two different data sets for answers based on that question, whether you're looking for commercial or residential service. I guess if we can go next slide there, Jim. So obviously we're dealing with a lot of telephone infrastructure and communications services out there. So we obviously are dealing with all the providers out there, and what we're really, like I said, trying to do here is when we get that data from the telco providers out there is we know the 477 data was not the best way or most accurate way to map this information. So that again is really where we're trying to make sure we get those buffers tightened up around their actual infrastructure. So we know, again, where those breaks are going to be to show where the service realistically stops versus, counting if they have one resident or one household in a census block. Typically with the 477 model, everybody was served in that census block. So that's really where New York is trying to get way down to, like I said, a very tight address level information, so we can do those queries and provide accurate information for those people looking for service out there. We can go next slide. So obviously, I think we're dealing with a shrinking CLEC population out there. So obviously, between changing services of people getting away from hardline phone services, the advent of voice over IP, the competitive exchanges out there, are maybe having some issues maintaining viable service out there, and between attrition of the business models not working and CLECs being purchased by other and gobbled up by other carriers out there, we know that's kind of a shrinking market out there with the state of IP communications over for voice services out there. So go ahead and next slide. So again, this is kind of an example of obviously our cable providers are going to be one of our biggest options to be able to deliver broadband services out there. So obviously this is going to be one of the critical pieces that we're going to be collecting out there and be able to meet those broadband speeds that we're going to need in the future. Obviously, with everything moving away from the 25.3 kind of designation of broadband, coax is basically the next biggest option that we're going to have out there to be able to meet those speed demands. So they will have more than likely the lion's share of coverage throughout New York State. Obviously, we'll have some pockets of fiber to the home services, and in the urban and suburban areas, you'll see more of those fiber to the home deployments. But we've obviously got coax that will be here for quite a while and be able to provide those services to meet those broadband needs that we're looking for out here as well. So again, this is just kind of another piece that we're going to be assembling on the GIS backend from these providers out here that you see on the screen. So go ahead, next slide. So we do have another component that we are collecting data on out there, and that is the fixed wireless services from the WISPs within New York. So this will be a little bit different mechanism for us kind of populating the service screens out here, because obviously you cannot map physical wireless coverage based on, hey, I see a tower there and there's a a receiver or radio antenna on the side of a house. We're not going to be inventorying with our OSP folks out there for that. So what we're actually going to be relying on is for the wireless providers to give us where their tower or distribution locations are for their point to multi-point services. And from there, we're going to use basically some coverage maps that we should be able to hopefully somewhat accurately display. It'll be, kind of depending on the amount of tree clutter in the area and that type of thing, we should be able to get a general shape assembled for those wireless service providers out there to give a depiction of their actual service territory. So again, that'll be overlaid into the GIS for the other wireline providers. And if that push pin does fall through that wireless provider's buffer, then that will be one of the answers that will end up showing up on the screen for the results of service providers at that particular location. So, okay, Jeff.
Hey, Corey, we've got a question. Someone wanted to know, and this is a very common question. I'll relay this to the audience. We hear it virtually every day, and I think Corey and Joe are in the best position to address it. Question is, can you explain in more detail what accuracy is possible regarding where infrastructure is available, what you actually need to do to verify address level data on a site visit, and how common are site visits expected? Then the second part of that question is, who will control or who will be able to access the GIS data sets that we're referencing?
Yeah, why don't I start with that one, Jeff? Basically, in terms of the accuracy that we're gaining, these folks are literally in front of your house. So when we say the coax stops here or the fiber stops here, that's because we're out there, we see it, we document it. In some cases, we take a picture of it, and that information is used. It's fairly accurate. I mean, it's extremely accurate to the extent possible, because if we can't identify infrastructure, we may suspect that it's there, but if we can't physically identify it and point to it, then we can't document it. Because if we do document something and it's not there, then obviously that calls into question the entire survey. So from that perspective, the accuracy is very accurate. It's also used to get grants. So we've had a fairly good grant hit with that. I would say 100%, because we're able to take that information and show exactly to the grant provider, here's where it stops and here's why, and show a picture of it. So it's unquestionable at that point. And also now some of the counties are using this information to go back to their providers and say, I know you stop here, right? I want you to continue down this road, or I want you to continue to serve this area. What's it going to take? What's it going to cost? And the providers themselves, in many cases, are coming back with budgets to say, okay, to extend it from this site out to these homes, it's going to cost X number of dollars. So the accuracy is there. And so far, we haven't gotten any pushback from the counties themselves or the providers on errors. There are some things that'll come up, obviously, but it's not 100%, but it's about as accurate as you're going to find in the industry. And then in terms of who's going to control the data that we're gathering for DPS, the Public Service Department, they're going to control. And right now they're discussing with their legal team how they can make information available, what information they can make available, and when. So, we're waiting for them to come back to us and say, here's exactly what we're going to provide. As Corey said, the website is going to be public. So you're going to have access to that in May when we open it up. But as far as the physical level inventory, right now, what we're telling communities is to reach out to DPS, let them know you're interested in the data, and then they're working through their legal process to make it available. And that's the best that we can tell you right now on those two questions.
Joe, I might add, we often have these discussions with the counties that we meet with, and I'll talk about these meetings in just a moment. And one of the points that we would like to make is that the folks that we're working with DPS, and understand this is not the broadband office, this is DPS, they really come across as being genuinely interested in this, all this work occurring for the benefit of the citizens of the state. It's important, I think, for all of us to realize that, like many entities within the state, they don't have a lot of resources. And one of the things that Joe and Corey have done a very good job of is sort of triaging requests that might be directed to DPS. So they actually take the time to get involved with individual counties, look at what those requests are, and figure out if it's possible to work between the county and DPS to ensure that DPS simply doesn't get overwhelmed by continuous requests for information that may not be complete yet. Joe alluded to the fact that about 50% of the groundwork, so to speak, has been completed in the state. Understand that that's raw data. It has to be brought back in. It has to be validated, QC'd. We get carrier information. We go back and QC that information as well. That's an iterative process. So it's not like we have fully baked information that DPS has access to in order to utilize. So those are two components that we always urge each county to keep in mind. Corey, anything else on this slide? Are there any other questions at this point?
I guess I might just add one little bit then on the accuracy question there as well. So obviously, as our folks are out in the field there, it's, again, to the extent visibly possible when they're identifying that infrastructure, right? So we've run into some issues with some of the counties that we've worked on in the past where, again, our folks doing the road surveys out there didn't note some infrastructure out there, and it turns out, there may be some instances where a provider comes in on the back or the rear right of way that might be out of visual sight from the actual roadside. So there are going to be instances like that, like I said, where our road crews are physically not going to be able to see that infrastructure. But with the DPS project, the big portion of that is hopefully now that we're getting the provider data come back in over the top of what our OSP folks did on the physical inventory survey is, like I said, we kind of marry that data up to really try and fill those gaps and make sure we've got a nice tight model to be able to, again, provide that distance calculation from the particular residence that's going to be looking to query from that address.
Corey, I'll make one more quick note for everyone that may not have background in this. This really isn't an aimless shot in the dark. ECC has a significant amount of information available based on work we've done in the past, based on our relationship with other counties in New York, based on our relationship with regional authorities. In addition, we'll overlay GIS information that we've procured from counties in the past. On top of this information, we'll consider FCC mapping data, and then we'll also consult other third-party data, which has proven to be reliable and credible, and to ensure that we mash all of this together to give us a more accurate picture of where we expect to find inventory. So we have a starting point as opposed to a blank sheet of paper. When you have a starting point, you certainly will be more efficient and effective in performing this type of work, because not only are we validating the existing inventory, looking for changes in the existing inventory, for example, where new fiber could have been added to utility poles, or new pedestals are evident for underground utilities, but we also are looking for new intersections of fiber where we see new splicing or new equipment, and we can see new fiber routes are branching off from what we expected to see and what we're validating. So there actually is a true method, true set of processes are in place to allow for this to be a more accurate exercise.
Okay, let's move on.
So the third part here is to talk about the broadband assessment. And we term it within ECC as being the Broadband Availability and Adoption Toolset. The acronym for that is BAT. And as you can see from the verbiage on the slide, it's an interactive survey tool. You can see a small copy of the current New York State site, Empire State Broadband, on the screen. There are a variety of ways to access it. One of the questions that we're asked is, well, wait a minute, if you don't have broadband access, then how can you possibly do this? Well, first of all, if you have internet access, you're able to do it. We deliberately do not put a lot of fancy schmancy content components in here. So we want to make it so that the instrument will execute whether you're on DSL or another type of low band service. You don't necessarily have to have a broadband service. But it's also accessible via cell phone. And many of our counties have requested we provide them copies of the survey instrument in writing so that they can make further efforts to distribute this survey out to residents in the county in ways other than requiring electronic responses. A couple things here. There's a speed test component, so that allows for an individual, and we say that if you're not at your location that you're reporting on your address, we certainly would like for you to not take the speed test. But if you are at that location, please take the speed test. There are a number of caveats around speed tests. We actually explain that in the frequently asked questions page on the site. But what happens is an individual comes to the site, they'll click one of the buttons, they'll take the speed test, they click the next button, and they're into the survey. Got a question here. Let me pass this back to Joe. I'd like to handle these questions in real time. Question is, will this mapping study result in better outcomes than past state presumptive or predictive flawed mapping exercises? So Joe, I'll hand that one off to you.
The answer to that is absolutely yes. The biggest issue we had with mapping in the past was that the information was provided by the providers. The FCC 477 maps that everybody was using for years, only to find out that the accuracy and the detailed level in those maps was not correct. So a census block, which is a given area in a community, if they had one person served, one household served, then they considered the whole census block served. And you could have 300 or 400 other homes in that census block. They have no broadband. So the level of detail and accuracy of the mapping is really where the rubber meets the road. And I think the level of information and the level of detail that the state is going to get out of this is more than they've ever had in the past. And it's more than the feds have had, and it's more than any other state has had. So it is groundbreaking for the state. We think the challenge going forward is how do they keep that going? How do they get the new infrastructure builds, and how do they document those? But I think what they're going to be starting with is an excellent source, very accurate source. So the level of detail is going to be much better than they've ever had.
Thank you, Joe. So there are a number of questions that appear on the assessment, and the way it works is there are only a couple of required questions. We ask for the respondent's address because we want to be able to geolocate the specific place that they're responding from. And then we ask them whether or not we ask whether they're residential or non-residential. We also ask whether they have active service or not. So depending upon the answers to those second two questions, those are the gating questions that establish the logic for what's going to be presented to the respondent. If they answer that they're at home, we will ask them as to whether they have a business from home. So are you operating a business or a farm? And if so, further in the assessment process, we will ask them, can we pose a few additional questions to you so that we can also get their response to the commercial questions. You can see an example on this page of a few of the questions. There are questions related to active service, the price you pay for service, the price you would be willing to pay for significantly improved service. There are also questions related to, as you can see in the last bullet, whether folks have had issues related to remote work, schoolwork, or medical care over the past year. And certainly that ties back to the period of the COVID pandemic. The key question actually comes toward the end of the survey. Once we pass the demographic questions like number of people in the household income, that sort of thing. We actually ask people to tell us what they want to express about broadband service in their area, in their county. And as you might imagine, those answers range from, we don't know why the government is even involved in this, ranging all the way to, well, why haven't you done something before now? What's interesting to me is in the past, when we've done these types of studies on individual county levels, we usually average about 1 in 3 respondents providing comments. Since we've initiated the New York State project, those comments are about 1 out of every 2. And we're going to encourage the folks at DPS to consider these comments very carefully, because we know when we do this type of work at the county level, county commissioners, county legislators, county executives, and managers read these comments through one into the other, because it is a vital methodology to allow the voice of their constituents to reach them and understand what these true issues are. We've had some questions about support. In other words, what are we doing to support the assessment? So on the right, I've simply got an example of some of the things that we do as ECC to support what the counties are doing. But you'll see the first bullet point where it's engaged locally. We have always believed and continue to believe, and we stress this at the beginning of this presentation, that local engagement is critical, that you have to be involved with counties. So part of what we're doing is we're calling all the counties in the state. We're speaking with the county executive, the chief operating officer, the chief information officer. Often we're speaking to industrial development folks. We're speaking to planning managers, all asking them, can you help us get the word out? Now, different counties are at different stages in terms of their broadband plans. Some, have broadband projects underway. Some are planning projects. Some have not even looked at it. They don't have time, money, or resources. Doesn't matter where you are in the project. We're here to ask for your help because we believe the end result is beneficial to each county, no matter where you are. One of the things we do, you'll see the big box there, we actually put together a generic project plan for each county. We make it available online to anyone within the county that's responsible for helping us with this work, so they can understand what our recommendations are over the past 5 years of doing this in order to garner attention and increase responses to the assessment. We'll share with them media that's been, or materials, collateral that's been put together by clients. You can see some examples here from Warren County. We'll create a unique URL for each county. So you'll see, for example, warrencountybroadband.com would be an example. We haven't created that one yet for use here. But what we do is, Steuben County is a great example. So www.steubencounty.
Jeff, I think we lost your internet.
It's easier to promote access to the site by using a local county name rather than I see it says my internet connection's unstable. Can everyone still hear me?
Yeah, we're good now.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you. I'll blame it on my local cable company. How about that? But what it seems to be is that if you use the county name, it's easier to encourage folks to respond. So in these calls, what we do is we ask folks within the county, can you please put us on your Facebook site, put us on your Twitter site? Those are initially where we get early hits in terms of getting responses. We ask the counties to put the link on their website, put it on the health department, the library site. We had one client where the sheriff's department put it up and we garnered 200 new responses in 24 hours. So really it's that simple. Just sort of help us get the word out, let us know how we can help, and we certainly will make arrangements to do everything we can to support you.
Yeah, there's 7.3 million households in New York State. We want all of them to respond if possible. Gentlemen, we got to watch our time. So I just want to make sure everybody's aware of the time.
So very quickly, when we talk about planning, we have isolated what we consider to be 5 key points related to broadband. And the first component that we've really discussed here today, and it really ties back to the New York State DPS Broadband Project, is discovery. And Joe alluded to this earlier, understanding where you're at today, and the issues and barriers that are related to availability and adoption. And again, we're speaking in terms of broadband. So it's not just internet access. We're talking about access to higher speed services. We get a lot of questions about funding. Here is a chart that simply provides a sample of some types of funding that are currently available today. With the time constraint, I don't think we have time to walk through all of these, but I'm sure that Kate and her team are actively working with each of you guys, and you guys are working as well to look at the varieties of funding that may be available from various federal programs that are coming from the new infrastructure bill, even the utilization of ARPA funds to help drive the broadband initiatives. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joe. And let me flip here, and I'm on a conclusion slide.
Thanks, Jeff. I want to say one thing on the funding side real quick, and that's it currently, if you're looking at the Reconnect grants, and the county is going to provide they're going to take the grant. It requires the county to own the infrastructure. So as you look at these grants, and yes, there's a lot of money out there, but keep that in mind. You really have to have your plan together to go after this money, so you know exactly what you're getting. Let's talk about the next steps. From an ECC perspective, we are planning, as Jeff had laid out, we absolutely need the communities to respond to this survey so that we can get the best data possible. So we're going to meet with each of the counties. We're going to talk to as many folks as we can to review the data, review the options, and get as much information into this system that we can. Then we're also going to talk to the counties to the extent possible on where you are. How do you move forward with this? What are your plans? Some counties are obviously much farther ahead. And then we'll work with you if need be to help you put a project plan together based on the data that's out there. We'll take a look at that. I'm trying to run through this quickly. Next slide, please, Jeff. So let's talk for just a moment on this. Every county out there, every community has an option. And, we strongly urge you to start thinking about your options now. Right? We know the data is there. We know the data is going to be coming, but we don't want to wait until a year from now or 6 months from now. You really need to start thinking about broadband in your community today. You need to start thinking about who would your potential partners be. And as I mentioned, the carriers and the service providers, they're not opposed to building infrastructure out to these areas that need it. What they're opposed to is building infrastructure somewhere where they can't get a return on investment. Obviously, as private investment organizations, it's important for their stockholders and shareholders to recover that money eventually. So we need to think about a few things. There's county-owned options, there's city-owned options, there's direct partnerships where the communities can provide incentives to carriers to build. All of these are in play. I highly encourage you to do all your grant research and look for these funding sources. That way they don't become burden to the taxpayer. And whatever you end up doing in this is think about the creation of an RFP to help solve these problems. And if you're fortunate enough to have providers who want to step up and help you through this already, then great. But if you're not, then consider an RFP, because what we're finding around the rural areas of New York State is there are others out there that they'll step in and they'll work with the counties and they'll build out their infrastructure for them. So there's no shortage of companies out there that want to help solve this problem. Next slide. And that brings us to the end. And I think time-wise, we're pretty good. Questions?
I'd like to ask, are there any additional questions? I see that we've got one that has popped in here. Okay, yeah, that's a follow-up that's outside of this. So any other questions for Joe or Corey or myself?
I do want to interject too, because that was a great summary. So I want to thank you, first of all, for the great information and, quite honestly, the frank conversation, just in terms of your experience in broadband and your expertise you've gained in working with a number of communities on this issue across the state. So first of all, thank you. I think that's great information. I want to thank the audience for great questions so far in terms of the some really technical questions, and those who we know from speaking with many of you are working hard at the local and other levels to advance broadband connectivity in varied parts of the issue. So what we just heard from Kevin O'Connor is one example in the region that we see as an opportunity. So Kevin O'Connor, on behalf of Albany County, was citing their broadband initiative that's ready to begin. So one thing that we continue to look to do is connect and collaborate and be able to leverage what opportunities are available to meet the needs of the region. So I would ask that anyone who is working on individual initiatives, such as what Kevin put out there for Albany County, please contact us. We'll continue to make sure that we are coordinating and letting you all know of each other's efforts. And especially when it comes to grant funding or looking at kind of that economy of scale at times, there can be some definite opportunities to working together. So just know we're here as a resource. We want to continue to assist in that venue as you all look to do the good work that you're trying to do locally. So keep that in mind as well. Are there any other questions in terms of?
Okay, yeah, I've got a couple questions.
Great,
So,
go ahead, Jeff. You can read them off.
Linda, and I would screw your last name up so badly, I won't say it. So just Linda. We conducted a survey about 7 years ago. Are you interested in the data? I'm very interested in the data. My ability to use it for this project is limited. The capability that we have in doing this work with New York is we have the ability to utilize very recent data with maybe some adjustments and correlation between data sets. If the data is older than 18 months and we did not collect it, then the state has declined to allow us to utilize that data because they don't feel that it's current enough, nor is there the ability to have a correlation between the questions that were asked, given the environment at the time that the survey or the assessment was completed. There's a second question. Will we be looking at any LOE or geosynchronous technology platforms for broadband service?
Yeah, I'd like to take that one if I can.
Yep.
All right. Here's the reality of the situation when it comes to satellite-based. If you go to their website, the first thing you're going to see is service may be disrupted. I have a satellite phone. Sometimes I'll be out in the middle of the ocean fishing, and a lot of times my phone doesn't work, right? Or if I'm in the mountains somewhere, it doesn't work. So we're not, even though we know significant investments being made in satellite technologies, we're not to the point yet where we're willing to say, yeah, that's the end all. That's going to solve all the problems. And we're just not there yet until we figure out how to get through the reliability issues. And for those of you that use HughesNet, you know what I'm talking about.
Are there any more questions for us? Okay, I don't see any of my little screens, so I will give it back to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to say it's amazing to actually end on time or even a few minutes before. So it was just that efficient, I think, in terms of conversation and getting the answers and the information that people are looking for. I'm going to take it as that. So I want to thank you very much for the presentation again, and everyone for attending. We hope that, again, this was useful information. And we look forward to communicating with you in terms of next steps and coordinating your local broadband initiatives moving forward. In the meantime, please get the word out. The website, empirebroadband.com, correct? To your local contacts so they can participate and only enhance the data that's being collected through this statewide initiative. So thank you for attending. We'll also be sending out the slides as well as this website link as well to be able to pass on. Thank you for attending, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much.